Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on Women, Naturally Better Leaders for the 21st Century. This is the second in our series of global webinars based around our white papers which have been published by Routledge. These webinars are sponsored and endorsed by Routledge and Virginia International University. Routledge is the publisher for our forthcoming book, Leading Beyond the Ego, How to Become a Transpersonal Leader, which is now available for pre-order on Amazon and which will be published on the 9th of March next year. We also have a partnership with the Virginia International University, who are also sponsoring and involved with the first inaugural Ethical Leadership Summit, which is going to take place in Washington, D.C. in the springtime, which Routledge are also supporting. And we're working increasingly closely with the Virginia International University going forward. So since we have a global audience, we realize that for some of you it may be early in the day, and whilst for others quite late, so I'd like to wish you all a good day. Before we get started, I'd just like to make a few housekeeping points. There is a chat facility which you can use to communicate your comments during the webinar, and a Q&A facility which I would welcome you to use. We won't necessarily answer all the questions immediately. We're likely to hold some of them for live answer at the end of the webinar. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. But in the meantime, please feel free to bank your questions through that facility on the screen. At different points during the webinar, we will run polls, and we'll give you a minute to select your most appropriate answer, and then we will share the poll results with you. We are recording and streaming the presentation, so after the webinar, we will email a PDF of the slides as well as a link to the recording. I'd now like to take great pleasure in introducing LeaderShape's Chief Executive, Greg Young. Greg has recently been appointed to the role of Vice President for Balanced Leadership for the Professional Women's Network in London. Greg has been a driver of diversity in the boardroom for many years and has a special interest in gender diversity. It is crucial that men are engaged in the promotion of women leaders because, after all, if an all-male legislature had not passed laws enabling the female franchise, then women would have never been given the vote. Diversity in organizations is entirely congruent as part of the transpersonal leadership approach and is shown to lead to better decisions and success, of which we will speak more of during the presentation. So I will now hand over to Greg and cut off my video, and look forward to your questions and responses later on this afternoon. Thank you.
Danielle, thanks for that introduction, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I've put up on the covering slide here a copy of the front cover of the white paper upon which this webinar is based. It was sent out in late last year during the presidential election, and it acknowledgeably, I think, has quite a controversial title, and that was provocatively so. We did have some feedback on the white paper at the time, positive and negative, and it was quite interesting where that feedback came from. So of the positive feedback that we had, all of it coincidentally came from women. The negative feedback, on the other hand, apart from one woman, all came from American males. So I think it may have hit a raw nerve, especially around the presidential election time in the States. But anyway, the good thing about it was that it created debate. And I think this is a subject that needs to be talked about and learned more about. And certainly I'm hoping to learn from this webinar myself today. So what we'd like to do, and Danielle's already mentioned, is that we have got a number of polls. So let's look at the first poll. So which of these skills do you think is particularly important for leadership in the 21st century? If you'd like to choose one, please. The thing I love about this poll is that we learn as much from you as hopefully you'll learn from us. So what's coming through here is that the key factor that most people think is an important and imperative for companies in this 21st century is around adaptability, closely followed by collaboration, and the values is coming up behind. That's really interesting. What's not featuring is technical knowledge or intuition, which is also interesting for us. Okay, so let's maybe come back to this later in the presentation. What I want to do before we go any further is just to come back to some real basics and create a common understanding of what we mean by leadership. And for us, let's distill down to what the role of the leader actually is. So what I might say is the first primary role of the leader actually is to generate followers, because if you don't have followers, you're not leading anything. And then second is to bring those people, to a place they would not ordinarily go. Now, I'm not thinking necessarily about geography here, but I'm thinking about a state of mind, or if you're talking about, a vision in a company, getting the organization to do something that it wasn't doing before. But the most important word in this sentence is that word bring. So when you've generated followers, what you need to do is to metaphorically go to where those people are, put your arm around them and lead them to a place they would not ordinarily go. And then the thing that is often neglected is this inspiration of new leaders. So most people who come onto our programs, if they're in senior leadership roles already, and we ask this question, so who inspired you in your past? And it may be a teacher, a parent, an employer earlier on in their career, but they've nearly all had somebody inspirational in their orbit that's led them to be a leader themselves. So that needs to be acknowledged, I think. And this paper is one in a series to introduce the concept of transpersonal leadership. So let's just unpack, if you like, this word transpersonal. And Webster's dictionary has got a good, easy definition of transpersonal, meaning beyond the usual limits of ego and personality. So really what we're talking about here is transpersonal being beyond the ego. And as we're talking about transpersonal leadership, then we need to put those two things together. So what's a transpersonal leader? So a transpersonal leader is one who can operate beyond the ego and continues their personal development and learning throughout their life. And because they're doing this, they can be radical, but at the same time maintain a basis of ethics and authenticity. So the thing that they do for organizations is to build into the DNA of that organization that authentic, ethical, emotionally intelligent piece. Of course, they also build collaborative relationships and create that performance-enhancing culture, which importantly is sustainable. So if we look at all that in the round, we usually start when we first engage with people, and we're around this launch phase. What we frequently observe is this phenomena of rational, ego-based, as usual leadership. I'm sure if you look around your organizations, you can probably identify these people. Often they've got more of a management fix than a leadership fix. But actually, when we take them on this journey, we have an intermediate step before we get to the transpersonal leadership piece. And that's to become a robust, emotionally aware leader. And this is all around emotional intelligence and being able to generate those followers before you can go on to that advanced level of being able to be radical, ethical, and an authentic leader. So this is the journey that we take people on. And if we look at the whole piece together, then it all knits together to create this journey towards a transpersonal organization, which is high performance in its characteristics, but importantly, it's sustainable high performance. So why don't we take a look at the next poll? So now we're beginning to focus in on the women's agenda. And so the question is, what do you think are the biggest challenge women face in becoming leaders in today's world? And what I'd like you to do is to choose one out of all of these. This is a really interesting result for me, that perception of gender stereotyping. Men hold the majority of leadership roles, and women's ability to lead is often undermined by gender stereotypes. And what's coming in second there is within women themselves, that lack of self-confidence and self-belief. So this is Danielle may have said that we're holding two webinars today, one to catch the early part of the world that their time is ahead of us, and And this one now, which is not only hoping to capture people in the UK, but also people in the States and what have you. This is quite a different result than we had this morning, which just goes to show that there are different issues in different parts of the world. So thanks for that. If we could just look at this whole thing about balanced leadership and why it's important. Personally, I'm one of these people that just believes that it's just the right thing to do. But in a business environment, that's not sufficient to create a difference in culture and a real shift in how we deal with things. So what are the reasons that we ought to be discussing this? And I think that the first one is because actually the business environment is changing. When we've got things like globalization, artificial intelligence, digitization of stuff, then what we're facing now is a step change. It's not a continual change, it's a step change in the way business needs to be running. So it brings with it all manner of things around innovation, around thinking, around adaptability. And this is an imperative that business needs to change. And this is one element of that. So we also need to acknowledge that client bases are changing. So more women are involved in the buying process. As with your suppliers and your clients, more women achieve higher levels of leadership in those, then they make more buying decisions. And let's face it, if you're in a retail business, it's women that do the buying. The women are your clients. So you need to be more like your clients in the way that you operate. Then, of course, we're talking about 50% of available talent here. We often hear about the war on talent, the war for talent, retaining talent, gaining talent. So let's make the most of talent. And much of that talent lies within the female gender. In going back to this business environment changing, we need to look at things from different perspectives. And the reason that we need to look at things from different perspectives, this isn't necessarily just around gender, but it could be around ethnicity, it could be all manner of things, is to test those decisions to make them better. So as to get the broadest intelligence you possibly can to inform the decisions that you're making. Of course, that leads on then to being innovative. If you've got the broadest intelligence you have, that's when you can afford to be innovative. And if necessary, be really radical in what you're doing to really shift to this step change that the world is presenting to you. And finally, as you've pointed out in the poll already, it's because we need to overcome the bias in the workplace as well. It's well known, actually, that companies with more women on their boards perform better. And I think that this, is a real element that needs to be acknowledged, that women on board, the companies perform better. Okay, so let's move on now to emotional intelligence. This is a photograph I frequently show in the workshops that I run, thinking about how we can become emotional detectives in the way that we operate. And this is a photograph of a teenage girl. And it's only anecdotal, I know, but where I have mixed audiences, the question I ask is, what emotion is being expressed by this teenage girl? And frequently, what I will get from men is happiness. That's it. But sometimes from the women, what I will get is, well, the overwhelming emotion here is happiness, but what I'm detecting is nuances of something else, fear, anxiety, something else that's informing me. Now, it just so happens that I know the backstory to this photograph because it's my daughter, Rennie, who came sailing with me one day. She loves sailing. She loves fairground rides. She loves the whole high octane thing. But we got caught in a squall, and it was a severe squall. And so although what I was hearing from her was shrieks of laughter, actually, when I took this photograph, and I have to apologize for the quality of it because it was taken on an old iPhone, but there was also underneath it, oh, we've been in danger. And, there's just a bit of fear and anxiety behind it. So I think that's a really good illustration of looking beyond what first presents itself and becoming those emotional detectives to get into emotional intelligence. But we need to look at emotional intelligence really as a framework. And in that framework, the easiest way to assemble this is to use Daniel Goleman's model, which is to look first at self-awareness and then around self-management. And then by extrapolation, move on to social awareness and relationship management. So that's, first of all, is within oneself and then looking at what's going on around you. And within that, there are within those 4 competencies, there are 19 capabilities. And if we look down the column on the left-hand side, it contains things like emotional self-awareness, accurate self-assessment, self-confidence, emotional self-control, transparency, adaptability, those things. And then if we go to the right-hand side, we have these things like empathy, service orientation, influence, developing others, those sorts of elements. I suppose for me, what this framework brings up is that the left-hand column is kind of around leading oneself, and the right-hand column is more about leading others. All right, so let's take it to the next poll. And what I'd like you to do in this poll is to take a look through the list and choose 3 where you think that women are most skilled. So these are some really interesting results again. So what comes out first and foremost is empathy. 74% of you voted for that. Interesting, nobody thought that self-confidence was something where women excelled. Developing others, 69%. Service orientation, again, very powerful. Accurate self-assessment, somewhat less. Emotional self-control, less. Change catalyst, less. Inspirational leadership, okay, 15%. I'd just like you to hold in your minds and your memories, please, some concept of what these results look like, because I'm going to show you the results of one of our studies later, and you can see how these correlate or not with the results that we found. All right. Thanks very much. So let's just introduce you to the study that we undertook. And core to this study was this tool, this instrument that we have called LEAPA. Short for Leadership and Emotional Intelligence Performance Accelerator. Now, LEAPA is it's a research tool, and it's based on state-of-the-art 360 format. But unlike other 360 tools, what it doesn't do is to compare the individual to a series of norms. Instead, and in a 360 format, so it's self-assessment and boss, peers, others, and direct reports. In a typical 360 scenario. But what it asks instead is for each of the EI competencies of how frequently a behavior is observed. That's the actual. And then the other question is, and how frequently would you like it to be observed? And what this does is it gives us a gap, a difference, and we call this the difference index. So the smaller that difference index, the closer the individual is to performing in the ideal way. So the observed and the ideal, that difference is small. And within LEAPA, there are 92 statements that we look at. So that's 4 for each of the 19 emotional intelligence competencies. We also capture verbatim comments with this tool. And another key aspect of this tool is it compares EI competencies with leadership styles and how strong you are on those. But those are not part of this particular research paper, so I shan't be focusing on that today. So let's just outline the study to you. So the population included 161 senior leaders, and this was taken a while ago, and we've got a much bigger population now, so we're sorely tempted to repeat the analysis to see how the differences shift. But it contains 65 women, 96 men. So that in itself tells you that there are fewer senior leaders around than there are men. And it's just a reflection of the population, if you like. The study was UK-based. What we didn't do was to record ethnicity or language or any of those other diversity elements. which might inform this. So in that respect, it's kind of a blunt instrument. So we've got male versus female. And the subjects were drawn from, the public sector and the private sector and the not-for-profit sectors. So let's just look at the results that analysis showed. So what came as an observation is that women scored better. That difference index was smaller. So women were performing closer to ideal in 15 of the 19 emotional intelligence capabilities. And when we look into where women scored significantly better, and we use 95% confidence interval technique here, these things came out: service orientation, developing others, change catalyst, transparency, empathy, inspirational leadership. So, if you think back to that last poll that you did, how many of those were represented in that piece? But let's just look at the areas where men were stronger, and they performed significantly better in around that emotional self-control, that self-confidence, and that accurate self-assessment. So let's present these results in a slightly different way. And what we've done here is we've created a graph. And in order to make it meaningful, what we've done is we've subtracted the difference indices for men against the difference indices for women. So anything that's above the line, anything that's above 0, indicates that women perform better. And anything that's below the line indicates where men perform better. So you can see across the whole piece, and in fact it's quite stark, how women perform better in these 15 out of the 19 emotional intelligence competencies. There's something else in here for me which I just want to draw out. So if you look along the bottom line, you can see it starts with emotional self-awareness. And then when you get to the line called above empathy, so everything to the left of that line is to do with self-awareness and self-management. And everything to do with the right of that line is to do with social awareness and relationship management. So this is around leading other people as opposed to leading oneself, which I think is quite a stark contrast. I did mention before that within each of these competencies, we've got 4 statements. So what I'd like to do is to drill in a little bit and look at some of the key results that came out, 2 from where women perform better and 2 from where men perform better. So this first one looks at components of developing others, an area where women came out more strongly. And the key element in this, or the most profound one, was identifies opportunities and stimulates individuals to develop to their full potential. Now I ask you, who would not like a boss like that? I think that's fantastic. So that's just, if you like, an observation. Identifying those opportunities and helping individuals develop to their full potential. So developing others, key, I think, in 21st century organizations. If we look at service orientation for a minute, this was an interesting one for me because it talks about has an orientation towards serving others, which in my mind raises more questions than it gives answers, because is what's required here some sort of mindset change? Do we have in women a preference, if you like, instead of being the boss, the chief exec, almost I'd rather be second in command or something like that. So for me, this raises more questions than answers, and maybe in the Q&A at the end of this session, one of you could offer a reason why this might be the case. Let's move on now to 2 areas where men perform better than women. So this was an interesting thing for me: behaves calmly when under stress. So I think one of the perceptions of women is around emotional self-control and, in the office or whatever, being emotional. And I don't know whether that's true or whether that's just perception. Personally, I prefer to be in the company of somebody who expresses their emotion as opposed to somebody that you can't quite read what they're thinking. There we are. And the final one in this series, and this is the biggest difference, is confident in own abilities. And in LEAPA, what we mean by confident in own abilities is that kind of reassurance that you've got, as opposed necessarily to the bragging rights. But nonetheless, self-confidence is a recurring theme when we work with women who we're helping to develop for suitability for higher office. It's to overcome, if you like, often that lack of self-confidence. So let's just head for another poll, if we may. And this one is about how important do you think it is for women to help other women into leadership roles? And in this poll, I'd like you to choose just one, please. This is an interesting result. It's what you're actually saying is that actually it's very important for all people to help all other people to achieve that balanced leadership. The second, what came in second, but quite a long way second, was it's very important and women need to offer support and mentoring advice to other women. And it seems to me that, you know, it's kind of moved beyond that. One of the things that we frequently hear, often from women actually, who want to get ahead in organizations and get into the higher positions, is that frequently there would have been a woman who may already be at that level or higher or what have you. And there appears to be some almost active harshness in that individual and testing and being more challenging for the women coming up behind her. And so it's interesting to see this result coming in. Okay, so we've talked about the observations, the results from our study. I suppose the question next is, what are we going to do about that? What sort of strategies do we need to put in place to address the results that we've got, where women are really strong on the 15 and the 19 EI capabilities, but the men have the self-confidence. But what we're not necessarily getting very quickly is this strong pipeline of women leaders. So here are some thoughts. And I'm taking this for the time being from the UK. By the way, Scandinavia, I think, is a standout area of the world where, you know, women already are making very strong inroads into senior levels in organizations. And I think that they've got there through positive discrimination and in having, you know, allocated levels, you know, almost under law to get there. But in the UK, we have the FTSE 100, and the government has funded an initiative called the Hampton-Alexander Review. And what that found was that actually on all of our FTSE 100, so that's the top 100 companies in the UK, there is a woman on the board of each of those companies. So that sounds really good. But actually the majority of those women are in non-executive roles. So what that says is that men still have the powerful roles. And so the next target that the Hampton-Alexander Review is introducing is for the allocation, and although it's voluntary, but these companies have to publish where they are on it in their company annual reports, is to assign a 30% target for the executive committees and their direct reports. So we're already beginning to drill down into the organization and find out where the real power is. And although what I've said at the moment focuses just on the top 100, they will be moving out to the whole, or to the whole of the FTSE 350, which is the top 350 companies in the UK. It's a good place to start, but we really need to make it universal. So setting good targets is a key. So if you set a target, you can measure yourself against it. The next thing we need to do is to create the right HR policies that create the right environment. So typically we may be talking about terms and conditions, maternity and paternity policies. Most countries now have some element of a maternity leave policy. Not all have a paternity leave policy, and I know even among those that do, then frequently the paternity leave after a birth of a child, for example, is not taken up by the man. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. You know, sometimes it's machismo, sometimes it's peer pressure, sometimes it's kind of just the culture in the organization is just not expected. But of course, the unexpected consequence of not taking up paternity leave is that it keeps women out of the workplace. So actually, if you were to make paternity leave compulsory, that would allow the woman to get back into career mode, back into the workplace and onto their career trajectory. So simple things like that, I think, would be useful for organizations to review. And then in the white paper itself, I spoke about a case study of my days in the pharma industry, and I'm not going to go into that there. Please do get a copy of the white paper if you haven't got one already, and you can read up that case study for yourself. But this was to do with pharma in a sales environment. And at the lower tiers, we have the majority of whom were women. But as you went up from sales to sales management, territory management, regional management, sales director, there became fewer and fewer women. And so at the top, there were no women at all. So the question for us is, why was that happening? And so with some simple investigative work, what we found was, and this, again, I think is somewhat typical, that if a job description came out and it had 10 items on that job description, then a woman would go through it, and if she could find a couple that she couldn't do, then she was unlikely to apply for the role. On the other hand, with this inner self-confidence, if a man saw these 10 elements of a job description and could only do 2, they would still apply and have a pop. So what we did was to say, what do we need to change? So our organizational development policy has been developed over years and years, but those years and years of development have been in a very male-centric environment. So what do we need to do that's different? And the question that we asked everybody proactively was, what development do you feel you need to become equipped to perform at the next level? And had a positive dialogue about that. And then we provided the development for the women so that when the job descriptions for promotion came out, they could look at them and they felt comfortable that they could do them all. So that's what we did. And that produced a huge difference. So what we did is we put in place a woman-friendly development program. And then the fourth strategy I think that you need to adopt is, and this speaks to your poll results earlier in the webinar, engage the men. Danielle alluded to it in her introduction to me, but there isn't a woman in the UK who won't know the name Emmeline Pankhurst, who was a leader in the suffrage movement in the early part of the 20th century, and is largely accredited with gaining women's suffrage in the UK in 1918. So that's votes for women in the UK. What many people won't know is the name of somebody called Willoughby Dickinson, who was the man in an all-male parliament who debated pro the motion when it came for parliamentary debates and shepherded the legislation through the legislative process to get it onto the statute book so that women could vote. And so in an all-male parliament, you had to have a man to bring it through those stages. So engage men, because actually they can lubricate things and make things happen. And they're not necessarily your enemies. Actually, you know, here I am talking to you as a white middle-aged man. So some of us believe in the feminist cause. And finally, I'd say avoid tokenism. Diversity itself on boards and as senior leaders is not the point. It's the ability to leverage that difference in views, opinions, and everything else, which is the real strong point. And that's that provides the key. So those are the 2 shifts in culture that I would recommend. So what might a program look like to do this, to achieve that? So this is a suggested development program. So to start with, we would always suggest that a program should be a blended one, which would include elements of input, so around masterclasses, online learning modules, importantly work-based learning as well. But then there are some really specific things that I would recommend. And a development program should include one-to-one coaching, group action learning sets, because it's in that one-to-one coaching environment where a woman feels safe, if you like, to share, those elements of uncertainty and what have you, that confidence can really be built. And if we just look at this picture on the left-hand side, what I've done is I've created this balance. And this balance has got two elements to it. It's the supportive one, which is the encouraging and the nurturing element. And then there's the other element, which is challenging and stretching. And in order to build confidence and performance and all those sorts of things, you need to start with that encouraging and nurturing element. And once an individual feels more confident, then you can start to apply some stretch. So, what about speaking in a meeting, or what about making a presentation? Just things that help to bank this increased confidence. And then you can go back to it more encouraging and more challenging and stretching. So one-to-one coaching is, I think, a really important element. And the next one is I would include, and I've mentioned Leaper here because I think it happens to be the best tool. And that's includes some element of 360 feedback, anonymized 360 feedback. It's important that it's anonymized, because another thing that hasn't come up today is this phenomenon of the imposter syndrome. I'm going to be found out as not being as good as people think I am. But the really reaffirming thing about a good 360 is that the candidate themselves, the woman themselves, will frequently mark themselves down on many attributes. But then in an anonymized objective feedback, when the results come back and all of the hidden strengths are shown, and in a 360 that includes verbatim comments, those are correlated with the comments that come in behind. Yes, you're doing a fantastic job. We'd really like you to do more. We'd really love you to be bolder. These are really reaffirming statements that the coach can work on with the individual and help to overcome this concept of the imposter syndrome. And the sort of content that we would have in this program would include things like building the emotional intelligence and leadership styles, how to communicate effectively, values and decision making. What I would draw your attention to is the last bullet in this series, because I think what's important is to provide a good framework for how women can influence. We think about leadership often as the people that report to you, leading the people that report to you. But actually, if you want to be on a trajectory for higher office, what you need to be doing is influencing the people beside you and the people above you. And you can use Daniel Goleman's leadership styles in a way that helps, in a simple framework, in a way that can help you to do that. And that's something else I think that's really important to include in a development program of this nature. So if we could head to our fifth poll, and this poll is asking you about your organizations. And the question is, what does your organization do to encourage and develop women leaders? And this is a multiple choice again. So I'd like you to just click on all the ones that you think apply to your organization. So what the results show here is that actually the most common answer is that we run leadership development programs that are the same for men. So there's no differentiation between men and women. And that kind of feeds into, OD policies and development programs that have developed for years and years in a male-centric environment. So maybe it's time to just refresh one's view of how one develops people in your organization and take more into account those elements that would really benefit women in that equation. What came in second is we offer HR policies that support men and women who have families. I think that's really great. It's still 38%, which is under half, but nonetheless, I think it's important to accommodate the needs of people who also have families. And then the next one, I think, so we do not aim specifically to develop women leaders. So I think that says much about organizations represented in this webinar. Thank you. Thank you very much. Food for thought. Maybe we can draw more on that in the Q&A. I mean, that was really my last slide. So these are the other titles in the series. We've already had a webinar on how to develop ethical leaders. And I think if you get in touch with us, if you missed it but would like to hear what was said, then I think that we have that which you can send you. This is the webinar on women and naturally better leaders for the 21st century. But we also have white papers which are available through our website on sustainable leadership, rewire your brain for sustainable success. This is very important for leaders because it helps to overcome possible burnout. And in a more and more diverse world, leading across cultures, I think, is a really important title. And finally, there's one which focuses on leadership in India. And forthcoming other white papers include leadership in China and adult development and its role in the leadership journey. So in our final poll, what we would just like to know is a little bit more about what you might be interested in for other webinars, and then we can go into the Q&A. So again, multiple choice, if you can just tick on the ones that you would be interested in attending. And that really helps us to target. Leading across cultures is one that is definitely there's interest in and around sustainable leadership and adult development in the leadership journey. So that's great. Okay, thank you. And then what I want to do is to just show you a very generous offer that our sponsors, Routledge, have made in conjunction with these webinars. And so you can get a very generous saving off some of their books, or in fact, the portfolio of all of their books. So there's 20% saving off all print titles ordered via their website, routledge.com, by entering the discount code LEAD1 at checkout. And that's available until the 31st of May next year. Incidentally, that also covers the book when our book will be launched, so you can get Leading Beyond the Ego at a discounted rate. We did have one question which was sent to us ahead of this webinar, and that was the question, are women more ethical than men? Which I thought was a really interesting question, especially given the preamble about this paper coming out during the US presidential election, and if you like, what's playing out now. So the quick answer to that is that I don't think that the study that we undertook contained sufficient numbers to be able to detect a statistical difference in those two populations. But what we do have is just some data which begins to indicate around parameters of conscientiousness, trustworthiness, the difference indices for women were smaller and therefore they operate closer towards ideal. So that's what I can offer at the moment, but that's the only thing that I can do at this stage with respect to answering that question. So we've got a question come flooding in. Do you think women are just looked on as less able than men? Do you really think that it will ever change? Do you know, I think it will. I think that this is somebody asked me last year and I said to them, I think that this century is the century of the woman. And I think that perception of women in the workplace will change hugely. I think partly from necessity, and these are the things that we spoke about very much earlier in the webinar around step changes in the business environment. And actually, you know, men have been doing it for thousands of years, and do we have it right? No, we don't. And now is the opportunity, I think, for women to come in and make a significant contribution to the radical shifts that need to take place. So I do think it will change. Do I think that they're looked upon as less able? I think that very much boils down to the culture which prevails in organizations. So the culture needs to be shifted, often by men. I had an interesting discussion last month with somebody called Helen Clark. Now, I don't know if any of you might know who Helen Clark is, but she was the first female Prime Minister of New Zealand. And what she was saying was that the biggest boost in her life, really, in prepare herself for becoming Prime Minister, was the fact that she was one of 5 girls and she grew up on a farm in New Zealand. And she said, if we'd had one brother, that one brother would have had all of the physically challenging jobs. But because there was none, those jobs were all shared out equally among the daughters. And so we just had to do everything. And through her career, and she was one of the candidates, one of the 12 candidates for Secretary General of the United Nations. There were 12 candidates, 9 of whom were women, 3 of whom were men, and a man was appointed. So I'm not sure that the world is ready for a female Secretary General of the United Nations yet. But what she was saying is that all the way through her career, she's regarded it as a genderless environment. And so easily, not one of those things that, where women are looked on as not able. I've got a question from Heather Katz. What could enable men in organizations to truly encourage and support women in their organization to go for the top jobs? I think that's an interesting question, Heather. I think there's a video that went viral on YouTube some years ago called Leadership Lessons from the Dancing Guy. And it was a video of a guy dancing on a hillside, and over the course of around 3.5 minutes, it was around the formulation of a movement. What the narrative was really about was identifying first followers. So I think that one of the things that women can do is, instead of just shouting in the wilderness, as it were, is to take the time to identify in their orbit, in their work orbit, who their first followers might be. And once they've got the male first followers coming through, then you begin, just like the dancing guy in the video, to create that movement. What else can they truly encourage and to support is, just give some nurturing and confidence building. We can be very hard on ourselves. And just, a well done and good work, I think, is really important. I can move on to the next question from somebody who's anonymous. Your polls, results and analysis seem to indicate that some leadership qualities come naturally and may be related to gender. Do you believe that all leadership qualities you're listed are teachable? Well, the whole thing about emotional intelligence, and I spoke about the term emotional detective, is that it's a muscle. And if you think about neuroscience, you can create new neural pathways. I think unlike things like IQ, which are fairly hardwired, emotional intelligence, and therefore the leadership qualities, can be learned. But it takes hard work, and it takes, so in the program that we might suggest, you'd need to be looking at least 6 months to help build that initial neural pathway and reinforce it and reinforce it and reinforce it so it becomes a new habit. So the quick answer to your question is, yes, they are teachable. I'd actually change that word teachable to learnable, because it doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. And I think that all of these things are learnable. So Evelyn, how can women sell their potentials to attract leadership amidst men in a men-dominated environment? Well, I think that goes back to what I was saying about the leadership lessons of the dancing guy. You might find in among that male-dominated environment, some men, the middle-aged white man, for example, like myself, who is really empathic to the requirements of building a balanced leadership organization. So I wouldn't start with all men. I'd focus on those who are more open to the whole cause and build a rapport with them and enroll them in the cause that you're looking to propagate. So we have another question here. Is there anything that you think women do in their organization, in negotiations or business relationship, that do themselves a disservice? Do women sometimes sabotage themselves? Oh, that's a really complex question. Is there anything that you think women do in their negotiations? So one of the interesting things that I've come to understand, and this sometimes has something to do with the gender pay gap, is that men will negotiate a package, a remuneration package, and will negotiate hard and end up with a better pay deal than women who are more likely, because of less self-confidence, necessarily to get themselves such a good pay deal. So I think sometimes, not negotiating is one of the things where women, I think, may sabotage themselves and do themselves a disservice. Be reassured and truly value your worth. This is why these programs that we've suggested are so important, because, in order to get to the top layers, you need to have that inner self-confidence to be able to negotiate and be robust. Remember that intermediate step that we were talking about, robust, emotionally aware leaders. So it's not shirking those difficult conversations. So that's where the disservice might come in. And Olivia, nice to have you online. How can women stop men typifying their behaviours as aggressive, and the same behaviours in men will be typified as decisive or showing leadership? Yeah, that's a difficult nut to crack, Olivia. What an insightful question. Do you know what? I think it's about approach. And it goes back to what I was saying about the framework of using the different leadership styles that Goleman had to offer. So out of the 6 leadership styles, we have the visionary style, we have the coaching style, we have the democratic and the affiliative styles, and we have the commanding and the pace-setting styles. And I think that the temptation is to maybe use the more aggressive, the commanding and the pace-setting styles, and they're really not good at leading sideways and upwards. Remember going right back to the beginning of this seminar when I said the first thing you need to do is to generate followers. And the affiliative leadership style is really good for generating followers. And the affiliative leadership style builds rapport, it builds trust. So it's kind of a campaign that you need to embark upon, but actually avoid the commanding and the pace-setting styles and use the affiliative styles of when you've engendered that trust and the rapport, then you can begin to infiltrate it with what your vision is for what you're seeking to achieve and getting people on board. So the whole thing is about generating followers in what you believe. I hope that goes some way, Olivia, towards answering your knotty challenge.
It is a knotty challenge because it's about the gender stereotypes that are still out there, and women being called aggressive when a man would be called assertive. And I can remember early in my career, as I was sort of getting to my first chief exec role, being called a pushy little woman. Now, they'd have never said that about a man. So I think that there is growing up to do in terms of a cultural shift. And all we can do is to demonstrate behaviours that are congruent with the type of leaders we want to be and win followers over, both male and female, so that the culture gradually shifts. It's not an overnight fix, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the last of the questions that's on the list. Are there any more?
Any more questions, anybody? Okay, well, we are virtually at 5 o'clock, so we are have done very well on time. So we'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you found the session thought-provoking. Please look out for our email with the slides and links to the recording, and do feel free to link in with us and to join our transpersonal leadership group and look out for future webinars. And again, thank you very much for attending the webinar this afternoon.